Hello to everybody. I'm Susan, one of the teachers here at IMCC. And tonight, as you know, we have a very special event with Mike and Mary Wilson, who are going to be presenting Walking in My Shoes. And just a few words about both Mike and Mary. I'm going to assume you've read the little blurb, the little statement on the website, but they're going to be telling us their stories. Their stories of growing up in our culture, the culture we all share, but is predominantly white and has been devoted in terms of policy to erasure, their discovery of their investigation of their indigenous heritage. Mike is from the Potawatomi heritage, Mary Lakota heritage, and just a few words about each. Mike is retired now, a psychotherapist, and he is an active participant in the Native social and ceremonial activities. He's a pipe carrier. They're going to explain, Mike will explain exactly what that means. Mary, also retired, has been a probation officer, a foster parent, executive director of a couple of organizations. One was called the Harbor in the Chicago area that offered shelter and transitional living to adolescent girls. And the second one is executive director in Tucson, Arizona, an organization called Family Counseling Agency that provided services to families, children, and seniors. So they'll tell you much, much more than these headlines of their resumes. Meanwhile, I'll just say before we start what we're going to do. And about an hour, Mike and Mary will offer us their offerings. And after that, we're going to have a Q&A or a discussion session. If you would like to offer a question, you're welcome to do this in the chat. And I will be the person who will offer the questions that you present to Mike and Mary. That way they don't have to try to look at chat and answer questions at the same time. So that's how we'll proceed. And if you want to have a question that comes up as they're speaking, put it in the chat. You're welcome to do that. Okay, that's enough for me. Please, Mike and Mary, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Susan and Judy, for all your technology work in the background as well, and everyone else just for being here. We do really appreciate your curiosity and your interest and the things that you do. I'm learning more and more about your group of people and kind of what you do. And that's just wonderful and exciting as well. And we really appreciate this opportunity. We're honored to be able to share our story and then to answer questions or discussion points. I just want to let you know that there are no bad questions. Curiosity is wonderful. We want to encourage you to ask questions. As our teacher and Blackfoot elder, holy man, would say, come with an open mind and the curiosity of a child. And so please do that. And we appreciate your time tonight as well. Mike, you want to do our land acknowledgement?
Yeah. For thousands of years, the people of the Monacan Nation have lived on, protected, and cultivated the lands on which Albemarle County and Charlottesville stand. These spaces were built via colonized labor on unceded lands. These spaces were built by enslaved laborers. As ancient people who thrive today, we acknowledge and respect the Monacan stewards of the land, the past, the present and the future, their youth and their elders. And so begins our little story. I guess I'll go first. I grew up in Chicago. I'm fifth generation Chicagoan. All the time of my growing up, there was an oral history that was passed along talking about how there was Native heritage that went back into the early 1800s on my mom's side. Later, it was identified as Potawatomi. I never attended in my entire educational, journey. I've never attended a public school. Because of medical issues, I wound up going to a private school, and it turned out to be a Lutheran school. So I spent 17 years in the Lutheran school system from kindergarten through college. Last 2 years I was in school, I spent time looking at Buddhism and comparative theologies. There were things about what I'd learned about Lutheranism and such that had left me uncomfortable. And in the meantime, started wondering, what else there was in the world. Was doing yoga and things like that while I was in college, as well as playing a lot of bridge. After I got out of college, one of my brother by another mother, was 2 years ahead of me in grammar school, high school. Art went on to be, pick up his PhD in psychology while I got my master's in social work. Along the lines, he journeyed with a Chippewa elder out of Wisconsin, Sun Bear. And in the course of those journeys, he would give me a call and talk about what he'd been learning from these Native elders. Prompted me to do a little bit more reading. And finally there was one day that I got a call that really kind of changed the direction of my life, and personally and professionally. I'll let Mary kick in now a little bit of her backstory.
I grew up in Madison County, just 30 miles north of Charlottesville, and grew up on dairy farms, primarily, some just farming as well, but primarily dairy farms. So I do know how to milk a cow. But I grew up in white privilege. I knew that I was half Native from the time I can remember. My parents are unique in that my dad is full-blood Sioux, according to the family history. Lakota was what he claimed always, and his relatives really came out of Canada. His mom was out of Saskatchewan, and his dad came down out of Ontario. And they met, came across the border, and did those kinds of things. But growing up, my mother, who was German and very German, made me appreciate and wanted to constantly talk about the fact that I was half Indian. So I grew up knowing I was half Indian, and in Madison County at that time, nobody else claimed to be Indian. So I was sure as a kid elementary school, that I was the only Indian other than my father east of the Mississippi, because I just didn't have any other frame of reference to go from. But growing up with this knowledge, I never felt oppressed. I never felt any discriminatory action against us. Education was public school, off to college, and so forth. So I never experienced what it was like to live with erasure, or what it was like to live with discriminatory actions. The best I can remember coming through high school was first year of integration in the South. And my mother integrating as a teacher into the school systems in a Black elementary school. That's a whole nother story. But so for me, I never felt different. I never felt like I could not do something. And I think you will find that this becomes a real important piece as we talk about how Mike's and my journeys continue even today. But I wanted you to really understand that background and growing up in white privilege for me was significant. And I think it's also significant for Mike because he too did not experience any of the negativity of being labeled as Indian. And we were called Indians at that point, not Native Americans. So you'll hear me use the terminology interspersed and meaning the same thing. As I got through college, started my career, started a family, Mike and I, by the way, each have what we call practice marriages. So this is a second marriage for each of us. And in looking back, what we've discovered is that we came together at that time in our lives when many of us have that passage point in your 30s and 40s where you're looking at, well, who really am I now? What am I here to do? What's going on with my life? And all those questions that make you look back and see what it is in your history, who you come from, where your roots are. And I was beginning to do that at a time when I was actually in Chicago. And that's when Mike and I actually had crossed paths. And this is before, I'm going back a little bit to give some history before Mike got that phone call that was so important from Art, his friend. We knew one another professionally for about 5 years. And that professional experience and meeting had really occurred because of a Native girl in Chicago who needed help. And she was hospitalized in a psych ward, really. And Mike happened to be her therapist. I, at that time, was running working for the state in Child Protective Services. And so I was the supervisor of the case manager who was working that case. So Mike and I were drawn together by a Native young woman, Native girl and her family. And then at some point, few years down the road from that, and I'll let Mike take over, he got that fateful call, and he wasn't involved with any woman at that time, and I was separated. So take off, Mike.
In retrospect, we've always looked at the fact that that the Creator winds up properly preparing us for the next step and opens doors. Some doors get shut for us, but others open, and understanding that we're we're where we're supposed to be and doing what we're supposed to be because that's what we're supposed to be doing. Initially, that was quite a struggle, but it became more of an article of faith and understanding that whom I'm with, where I'm supposed to be, and what I'm supposed to be doing. This too is one of those steps that was supposed to happen. Young girl wound up coming into the state hospital where I was a therapist, and they had all these wraparound services. They had children and family service. They had people from the community and other areas that were working with the mom, working with the girl, trying to support her so that she wouldn't get rehospitalized. But she was. During the course of working with her, discovered that the group of people who were in those wraparound services, we really enjoyed being with each other. And one of the things I found with the child was I asked her a simple question. I said, "Oh, you ever hear voices?" She said, "Oh yeah." "Oh, has that been something that's been going on for a while?" "Oh yeah." "Did that happen when you were on the children's unit?" "Yeah." "Well, how come you never told anybody?" "Well, nobody ever asked me." Okay. So we were able to get her what she needed, able to move her along. And after she was discharged, the group decided that, you know, we had enjoyed being around each other so much that going out for dinner, you know, once every 4 or 6 weeks was important. And mind you, in the Chicago area, there's a lot of places to go out for dinner. A lot more than Charlottesville. And we were actually, we're doing a barbecue at my place. And the caseworker said, "Well, how about if I bring my supervisor with?" Well, yeah, I guess she was peripherally involved. Sure. Mary walks in. We met her for the first time. Over the course of the next 5, 6 years, we continued to do things. I'd moved to Milwaukee, came back. And then there was the fateful day before the Chicago American Indian Center's powwow in November of '91, where the group was getting together at a restaurant prior to going to the powwow on a Friday night, which was really kind of more community night. And I was standing near the bar waiting for us to be seated. Mary comes walking in. There was a big hug, and
he followed
needless.
and he followed me around the powwow the entire night.
She was snagging or I was snagging, and yeah, it just worked out that way. That was the beginning of the relationship. And well, you know, mind you that we've been friends now for 5 years, and we discovered that we were both available, and that started to change the tone of things. And it's like, oh, having maybe something deeper with a friend. This might be interesting. And then the phone call came in from Art, saying that there was going to be this Blackfoot elder who was going to be putting people out on the hill doing vision quests in Alabama over Memorial Day. He said, "You interested?" I said, "Sure. What do I have to do?" And he said, "Well, you know, here's the guy's name, here's his phone number. You're going to have to send him some tobacco and, you know, ask him in a good, you know, traditional way." I hung up the phone with Art, called Mary and said, "Mary, you interested in going out on the hill?" And she said, "Sure." And she's on it off to work. And, you know, we started to do some preparation. in the meantime, in Evanston, there was this other Blackfoot elder who'd come into town and was doing pipe ceremonies. Now, a lot of people talk about a peace pipe, and that's a misnomer. The Lakota call it a chanupa. The Blackfoot call it a medicine pipe. It's an object. The stem is male, the bowl is female, and when they're joined together, it becomes a vessel for the tobacco or the smoking mixture, which is not wacky tobacco, mind you. That those prayers wind up being carried on the smoke to the Creator so that they can be answered. To have a pipe and to be a pipe carrier is a responsibility.
And they're two different things. You can have a pipe and not be a pipe carrier. You have a pipe for your own personal use.
Yeah.
And to pray with, whether you're praying for yourself or others or the environment, you're having that one-on-one communication with the Creator and offering your prayers. And the symbolism is the prayers are taken up to the Creator on the smoke. But to be a pipe carrier is something different, and it's more responsibility and deeper.
One of the other pieces as we were learning was to understand that the use of alcohol, we were told that when you used alcohol, your spirit would go on walkabout for 4 days, and you couldn't do ceremony for those 4 days. Now, as a pipe carrier, someone comes to me and with an offering and says, "Mike, would you pray, help, put prayers up for me?" And it's like, well, I just had a beer last night, so we got to wait about another 71 hours. That's just not okay. It's been over 25 years since I've touched alcohol.
Or other drugs that are anything other than prescription drugs.
Yeah.
Because you're always on duty. It's a 24/7 responsibility, not a job. It's a responsibility, and it's a choice that you make.
So on a Friday evening, I picked Mary up from work. We drove down to Alabama, and we wound up going into our first sweat lodge. We were preparing prayer ties, and we wound up being put out on the hill. Mary was the only woman that wound up going out on the hill. There were 6 other men. And the group that was down in Alabama had been following a Lakota elder. And so they were having hundreds of prayer ties. And this Blackfoot elder said, "Well, I've got these prayer ties I've cut out for each of you. There's 48 of them. And that you just make them, and that'll be fine. Have your flags for the different directions." It's like, okay, put them together. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm ready to do it, and I'm open to this experience. And what I experienced in those days that I was on the hill, I continue to reflect back, and this is 30 years ago. And I continue to look back and learn something new each time I revisit it. Mary?
Well, I was going to say that being out on the hill is basically Vision Quest. Some of you know it by that name. Mike and I really had never done ceremony other than a pipe ceremony. We had to obtain our pipes before we went down to Alabama. So it's like being thrown in the swimming pool in the deep end and saying swim. So it was all new to us. And I think that's where George's admonishment of come with a good heart, an open heart, and the curiosity of a child, you'll be fine. And I trusted that, and it worked out well. And from that, then, like Mike said, you look back and you see things that you experienced at that point in time in whole different light as you grow and change and you learn more. And over the time, Mike and I have gone into and experienced a variety, quite a few different types of ceremony. And each one has its own unique purpose, and each one is an experience, and each one leads you to a depth of knowledge, both internal, and then you learn something external as well. And when I think of mindfulness, I think of being out on the hill for 3 days and 3 nights without food and water, and you're really actually getting into the moment and really into yourself, and you can experience nature in a whole different way. And I looked at it from the beginning like, oh gosh, I'm going to be disconnected. I won't have a cell phone. Nobody can get to me. This will be great. And that has been one of the joyous things about participating in any of the ceremony, is that being able to be in yourself and mindful and still, and also with a group of people who are doing similar kinds of activities together and in support of one another, which gives me a little bit of a link to what you folks, I think, can experience anyway and do. But we've been involved with pipe ceremony. We've been involved with sweat lodge. We've done a vision quest. We've done a night lodge. We've done a Lawampi. We've had naming ceremonies because each of us, we do have names. And powwows. Powwows are a celebration, but they are also a ceremony. And it's like a gathering and more of a communal ceremony. But looking back, after that initial being cast into the deep end of the swimming pool, we continued on our journey and we began to travel. We traveled out west from Chicago. And one of the things I remember is going to Medicine Wheel out in that's Wyoming, Mike?
Yeah.
Okay. And Medicine Wheel is a very sacred place. And it was interesting for me because as we were hiking in, which was about a mile hike, we were getting closer and I knew we were pretty close to it. I just felt this urge and like something was saying to me, stop and smudge. And smudging, of course, is part of ceremony as well. And so we smudged. And then we went on and we met a Shoshone park ranger who really sat and he talked with us and invited us to walk inside the wheel, which not everybody got to do at that point. And we just didn't feel like we were ready to do that. And these are things that you have to kind of grow into, I think, as you experience different events. And so the medicine wheel wasn't something that we felt we could go into at that point, but we walked around the outside. Mike, you?
Yeah, there there were a trio of people, a couple of Anglos, and someone from the Crow Reservation who had been in the wheel. And when you walk a circle for any native ceremony, you're always going clockwise. And these people started in the gate. They moved to the point where they were going to, and they stopped and they did a pipe ceremony. And while they were doing the pipe ceremony, everybody was quiet and respectful. And when they finished, they came out, and the Shoshone interpretive ranger said, by the way, would you like to see where the little people live? He said, sure. And so they took the 5 of us down into this shallow cave where there were some visions that occurred. And the crow who was happened to be sitting next to me, I know he was able to see what I was seeing. And as we left and we were down in the parking lot, the 3 of them turned and looked at Mary and me and said, who are you guys? And we said, we're just passengers walking the red road. We're nothing important. We'd in about 96, we'd gotten a call from Art that he was having George come down into North Carolina and ask us to keep camp for George, because George was putting people out on the hill and Art was going to fast during that time. I was asking Art what they were into eating in those days, and he says, well, we're into all this vegan and vegetarian. And I was like, never mind, I know we got to bring George. Mary had flown into DC and picked up her son and drove into North Carolina from Virginia. I drove down from Chicago, walked into the building that George was at. It was late at night. I had my headlamp on. I saw George and I said, hey, George, how are you? He says, oh, Mike, it's good to see you. I said, George, I got something for you. I handed him a stick of jerky. He says, oh, I knew you were coming. When we were doing sweats, George said that the Spirit spoke to him and that there were other things that were coming up. End of 97, got a phone call and George said, listen, it's time for you to meet the rattlesnakes. I said, okay, where and when? He said, you're going to need to go to Fort Belknap in Montana and need to be there a certain date in June. So in 1998, we wound up going to Fort Belknap to what would be our first medicine lodge. At Belknap, they had a Lakota style medicine lodge, which is very similar to a Lakota Sundance lodge. It's the same but different. And if anybody if you want to read about it, there's a book called The Land of the Lakota, and they describe the medicine lodge in that. The first 2 years we were there, the request George had, he wanted me to learn, to observe. And so he had me fast while I was in camp. So when the dancers went into the lodge, I began my fast. And when the dancers came out of the lodge, I ended my fast. And there was this Native woman whose son's house we were camped outside of. And I was helping her with breakfast with some kids. And she said, well, Mike, are you hungry? I said, yeah, a little bit. She says, well, we got all this stuff. Do you want some? I said, no, thank you. Well, aren't you hungry? Yeah, a little bit. Are you thirsty? A little bit. Well, why don't you have some? I said, because I'm fasting. She said, how can you be fasting? I said, because I didn't put anything in my mouth. So I fasted in camp, and I started to learn about what that ceremony was. We were there for 2 years. We went for 2 years to learn about the ceremony before I made my first commitment to go in and dance in the sun in that lodge. And I wound up dancing in the lodge for 8 years. And that also meant that I was pierced on my chest and I was pierced on my back because there were 4 years that I dragged skulls as well. The first years that we were there, it wasn't until 2001 that we'd wound up in 2000. We moved to Tucson, and shortly after we moved into Tucson, Mary's mom came down from Virginia and was living with us. So we packed up an RV and we go up to from 40 miles north of the border to 40 miles south of the border. Took 3 days to get there. Mary?
Well, before you start down that road, going to and Mike refers to it as a medicine lodge. I refer to it as Sundance. And that's part of the difference between being Blackfeet and carrying blue color in the West and being Lakota and carrying a black color in the West. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But while Mike was learning about what it was like to dance, I was learning during that time, especially the first 2 years, what camp life entailed, what it was like to be a woman and what the woman's role is in traditional life on the reservation and in ceremony. And women have a real important role, being to support, to fix the food, to watch the children. The elders have a very important role, which is to teach everyone about what should be happening and what can happen, to answer questions. And that's real important. For women, it's also important that during any ceremony, you are not on your moon time. And this is not because you are unclean. It is because that is when women are in their highest point of power. Because we as women are life givers. That's why you're hearing with the Dakota pipeline and all that that's going on in today's world, that women are the water carriers. And when you think about it, we carry that life and nurture that unborn life in amniotic fluid, which is water based. So that's the connection of being that water carrier and life bearer. So it's our responsibility to bring life. That's part of our role, to nurture that life and to ensure that the tribe continues on and can walk in a good way. So I was learning those kinds of things, and lots of laughter. The women would get together, we would tell stories, we would talk about stuff that, women talk about. We talk about the men. We talk about other women. We gossip. You do all of those things. It's like being with your family and your close sisters. And in the Native community, you don't think of bloodlines. Children will come up to you and say, Auntie, I want so-and-so, or Grandma. And the children are expressing respect. And they know, if they have been raised traditionally, they know they can go to anybody in that in their tribe and ask for any help or anything they need. And we've had kids do that to us. I'll tell you a quick story on Mike, because we were there and George's one of his granddaughters came up to Mike. She was about 3 years old. She puts her hands up like kids do to pick me up kind of thing. And she goes, Grandpa. And Mike looks down at her and says, no, your grandpa's over there. She looks at him, she says, Grandpa, and she puts her hands up. I said, Mike, remember where you are. And he went, oh yeah, Eartha, come here. And he takes her and pulls her up. So these are things you have to kind of change your headset when you're around a reservation, or you're around people that have been raised and honor old time traditional ways of doing things.
One of the things, and I'm going to do a quick flashback. After we'd gone out on the hill and before we started going to Montana, we were doing pipe ceremonies with Buster, who is old running buddy of George in Evanston. And there was this one ceremony that we went to.
It was a pipe ceremony.
And the men are in one circle and the women were in another circle, because there's men's pipe and there's women's pipe, and men don't touch women's pipes, women don't touch men's pipes.
But there is a family pipe where men and women both share the same pipe.
Now, and this is Blackfoot, there with Lakota, there's a whole different approach with pipes, and whether they can touch the ground or you can't touch the ground. And there's a lot to it that you have to learn. But we were sitting there in this ceremony, and Mary and I were looking at each other and go, well, we have pipes, do you think we should have brought them? Well, no, we're not ready to be out here. We're not really pipe carriers yet. And at that particular ceremony, Buster had his helper go to a young man and pick up his pipe and the wrapping and take the pipe away from him, and told him, at this point, you had been told not to be doing ceremony with women on their moon, and you have conducted pipe ceremonies with women on their moon, even after being told not to. You cannot carry a pipe any longer. And we looked at each other and said, whoa, this is heavy stuff that we are into. This is important. Pay attention. There are rules here, and these are rules that are significant and need to be followed in a respectful manner.
And the rules are not just rules. They're because if you do things wrong, you run the risk of hurting someone. And you don't want to do that, because you're responsible to do things in the proper way. That's why you get told if you're doing things improperly, but you have to listen. So I'm going to move us along a little bit. So we've ended up experiencing a lot. We've learned a lot. And this has been over we worked with our Blackfoot elder over 16 years while he was still on this earth, and he's passed on. But we have come across other elders along the way, and every time we engage, we learn something, and our knowledge and our depth becomes greater and deeper, which kind of brings us more to where we are today. And we talked about walking the red road, and that walking is really about the journey. It's about how you learn, and you learn experientially. You know, you can read all sorts of stuff, but it's only about half of what's real that's being written down, because the native people were very good at leaving out the most important pieces as they told the white people about what was going on in ceremony and other things. So we have really stumbled along and learned. One of the things that happened for me as I have been on this journey, and this was happening while George was still alive, and I would go out west and to the reservation, and I would immediately drop into the role of a woman and the things that the women did, and it was just a natural place to be. It felt right. I would come back to Chicago and be in my executive director role, my leadership role, and be, you know, talking to legislators both in DC and in the state of Illinois, and doing all sorts of things. And it just felt really different. So I asked George one day when we were out in Montana, I said, George, how do you walk in two worlds? Because it seemed so different to me. And he looked at me and laughed. And he said, what made you think you're walking in two worlds? At the time, I did not understand it. And I thought, Jesus, I just asked you a simple question. Could you give me a simple answer? And of course, no answer is ever simple. You get told a story. But what I have come to learn is he was right. There is only one world to walk in. And how you decide to walk in that world is the way you experience it. So walking the red road is to be able to walk more of a traditional native path. It's how I relate to people. It's making sure that I'm trying to do it in a good way. When bad things happen, trying to turn around and bite my tongue instead of lash out sometimes, although it doesn't always work, I will tell you that. But fortunately, you know, you get back on the road. So the red, that's why there's not really a native religion. It's a day-to-day way of living. And part of that day-to-day living is giving thanks to Creator for the day, for your experiences, for what's coming up, to give thanks in the evening for the same, maybe to give thanks along the way and to pray, maybe not, depending on what's going on in the day. So walking the red road is really about walking in balance and trying to maintain yourself and the world around you, being respectful, and being, in some cases, I would say, in the moment. Mike, do you have anything to expound on there?
Yeah, the fact is that, and for those people that have gone into Buddhism, is recognizing that everything has spirit. It's not just two-legged, the four-legged, the winged, the fish that swim, the things that crawl underground, but the rocks, the trees, the grasses, everything has a spirit, and it's being respectful of that spirit. Giving thanks for the things that Mother Earth has provided us, You know, she gives us the plants that produce the oxygen that we breathe, that fixes the carbon dioxide, so we get more stuff. The plants that grow from her, all of those things, the warmth of the sun, and being able to understand and respect the spirit of all of that, which can be really pretty overwhelming if you stop and think about it. Makes you want to tread much more lightly.
I think it's also, and Willow, I bet you can attest to this, but there's something about being retired and having the responsibility of making a living kind of off your shoulders a little bit, that allows you to enjoy and participate in nature in whole, just different way than when you were, or at least for me, than when I was working and had to really be thinking about that almost 100% of the time. And I want to move us, because I'm watching time and trying to be mindful of that. But coming into today, Mike and I have walked, experienced all this. And what we're finding is that we've come into retirement, and we've come into our work in the last 5 years, because we've been fortunate enough to be retired for 5 years. And we found that our role as elders has just sort of bubbled up. Didn't really see it coming, sort of bit me in a way. But we had been in and have been involved at University of Virginia with NASU, that's the Native American Student Union. We've been supporting those kids for 12, 15 years now. And just by being there, sometimes they've asked questions, sometimes they've been trying to do ceremony, sometimes they've been looking for storytellers. There's just been a variety of things. We're also very involved in the last 5, probably 7 years with a university group that's now called NIRC, N-I-R-C, Native and Indigenous Relations Community is what that stands for. This is a group of people, some of you may have known Karen Wood. She worked with Virginia Humanities, Monacan woman. And Karen was highly involved in that and a very close friend. And we've been continuing to work with that group to bring more of a Native presence to the university. So part of what we've been able to accomplish this last year specifically is to have a Native Studies minor initiated at the University of Virginia. And that first classes were taught this fall. We're getting more Native professors coming into the university. And the President Ryan, is really beginning to be much more aware and I would say supportive in a cautious way, and I can understand that too, but we're getting support from a variety of different sources. The vision for that group, at least Mike and I have a vision that Karen had too, and that is to one day have an actual bricks and mortar center at the university for not only the university students, but for the community at large. There is no one place for natives in this area to gather. So you find little pods and groups of people that are native and performing some ceremonies and enjoying one another, but there's not a collective larger group as you'd find in some areas. And part of that is because of the lack of reservations in Virginia. But what Mike and I have discovered, and oh, I forgot, Mike's on a search committee at the University of Virginia right now that is choosing a Native professor, the next one coming in.
We're choosing a professor for Native American Studies.
Okay. See, I don't know it all. Anyway, but so where we find ourselves right now is in that role of saying to people at the center, at Belvedere, formerly the Senior Center, as they're looking at diversity and equity and all of these issues, what about Natives? What about Natives? And thus we've had this fall a Native Speakers Series. This spring, Mike and I are doing the film series with a discussion after. This has also led to me being invited to talk with Albemarle Social Services. The invitation from Susan, thank you, and your group here, and other things that are coming up for us. So we find ourselves really sitting in that elder role of saying, we're here, it's our responsibility to share what we know, and that's all we can share. We come at this, and I think you've heard this over the course of our presentation, we have both come at this because we've been involved with the Blackfeet and traditional Blackfeet elders. We know that different tribes will do things slightly differently, and that's their way of doing things, and it's honored as well. There's always a thread that comes through. There is a higher power, a creator, a master of life, if you will, and there are spirit helpers, and we just are here to try and listen and share what we know.
One of the
Mike?
One of the pieces of Native, traditional Native approach is that valuing of elders, which is really opposed to the colonialistic white society, where you've got 101 commercials about how do you get the lines that you can look young, and youth is pushed, and elders are just kind of push them off to the corner, and so that they're out of the way and not pester you. The wisdom of the elders is really sought, it's valued. As a clinician, recognizing that piece, that as we operate, we try and be like the pipe stem. That pipe stem is hollow. Nothing happens, but the spirit works through that stem both ways. And that we, in fact, are stems, that the spirit works through us. I was up in Alberta, and someone asked me what I did for a living, and I told them I'm a tracker. I go and find people who are lost, and I bring them back to a path. And we talk about what the advantage of walking that path may or may not be. I may have to go out and find them 5, 6 times and bring them back to the path and try and understand what it is about walking that path that's difficult. I can't make them walk the path. I don't have that kind of power. I can entrust them for that ability. I can't empower anybody, nor can any of us. None of us have got enough power to cure. None of us have the power to do that kind of healing except to work on ourselves and to pay that attention.
So we thank you for the opportunity to share.